You guys go play. I am Lady Rain. This is the Reader's Nook. Dogs are playing in the background. You will hear them. Anyway, part 10. They were talking about the fact that the government, or quote-unquote Dallas police, would classify this thing in the woods. Now he sat on a stump in Bobby's backyard. Without the slightest idea, there was a loaded shotgun pointed at the back of his head. He sat sitting of his mental replay of the party. It was so horrifying and so utterly obvious that he supposed he could have forgotten the time it had taken him to see it and grasp it. The ship in the earth could not be dealt with just on the same basis of Bobby's welfare or Haven's welfare. Regardless of what it was or what it was doing to Bobby or anyone else in the immediate area, the ultimate disposition of the ship in the earth would have to be made on the basis of the world's welfare. Gardner had served on dozens of committees whose goals ranged from the possible to the wildly crazed. He had marched, had given more than he could afford to help pay for newspaper ads, and 2 unsuccessful campaigns to close Maine Yankee by referendum. As a college kid, he had marched against the U.S. involvement in Vietnam. He belonged to Greenpeace. He supported NARAL, in half a dozen muddled ways. He had tried to deal with the world's welfare. But his efforts, although growing out of individual thought, had always been expressed as part of a group. Now, up to you, guard. Just you, he sighed. It was like a sob. Ring those funky charges, white boy. Ring those funky changes, white boy. Sure. But first ask yourself, who wants the world to change? The unfed, the unwell, the unhomed, right? Parents of those kids in Africa with the big bellies and the dying eyes. The blacks in South Africa, the PLO. Does Ted the Power Man want a big helping of... No, not while I'm reading, please.
Here you go.
A big helping of funky changes. Bite your tongue, not Ted. Not the Russian Politburo, not the Knesset, not the President of the United States, not the Seven Sisters, not Xerox, not Barry Manilow. Oh no, not the big boys, not the ones with the real power. The ones who drove the status quo machine. Their motto was, get the funk out of my face. There was a time when he would not have hesitated for a moment, and that time was not long past. Bobby wouldn't have needed any arguments. Guard himself would have been the guy flogging the horse until its heart burst. Only he would have been right in that harness too, pulling alongside. Here, at last, was a source of clean power, so abundant and easy to produce, it might as well be free. Within 6 months, every nuclear reactor in the United States could be brought to a cold stop. Within a year, every reactor in the world. Cheap power, cheap transport. Travel to other planets, even other star systems, seemed possible, after all. Bobby's ship had not gotten to Haven, Maine, on a good ship lollipop. It was, in fact, give us a drum roll, please, maestro. The answer to everything. Are there weapons on board that ship, do you think? He had started to ask Bobby that, and something had stopped his mouth. Weapons? Maybe. And if Bobby could receive enough of that residual force to create a telepathic typewriter, could she also create something that would look like a Flash Gordon stun gun, but which might actually work? Or a disintegrator, a tractor beam, something which would, instead of just going barum or wacka wacka
Hey,
wacka.
Mom, look at your screen.
Yes, I see my screen and I'm trying to read. I'm not stopping him because it's not often he plays with them. I made socks with fluff. And now they're turning to mush. because the dogs are finally playing with them. There'll be fluff all over the floor before too long. Would actually turn people into piles of smoldering ash? Possibly. And if not, wouldn't some of Bobbi's hypothetical scientists adapt things like the water heater gadget or the customized Tomcat motor to something that would put a radical hurt on people? Sure. After all, long before toasters and hairdryers and baseboard heaters were ever thought of, the state of New York was using electricity to fry murderers at Sing Sing. What scared Gardner was that the idea of weapons held a certain attractiveness. Part of it, he supposed, was just self-interest. If the order came down to put a sport coat over the mess, then surely he and Bobbi would be part of what was to be covered. But beyond that, there were...
Hey, Phoebe!
Nick, please quiet down a little, please. But beyond that, were there other possibilities? One of them, wild but not unattractive, was the idea that he and Bobbi might be able to kick a lot of asses that deserved kicking. The idea of sending happy time folks
Go get it.
like the Ayatollah into the Phantom Zone was so delightful that it almost made Gardner chuckle. Why wait for the Israelis and the Arabs to sort out their problems, and the terrorists of all stripes? Goodbye, fellas. Catch you on the flip-flop. Wonderful, Guard. I love it. Well, put it on network TV. It'll be better than Miami Vice. Instead of two fearless drug busters, we've got Guard and Bobbi, cruising the planet in their flying saucer. Give me the phone, someone. I gotta call CBS. You're not funny, Gardner thought. Who's laughing? Isn't that what you're talking about? You and Bobbi playing the Lone Ranger in Tonto? So what if it is? How long does it take before that option starts looking good? How many suitcase bombs? How many women shot in embassy toilets? How many dead kids? How long do we let it go on? Let it all go on. Love it, Guard. Okay, everyone on planet Earth sing along with Guard and Bobbi. Just follow the bouncing ball. The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. You're disgusting. And you're starting to sound downright dangerous. You remember how scared you were when the state trooper found the pistol in your pack? How scared you were because you didn't even remember putting it in there? This is it all over again. The only difference is that now you're talking about a bigger caliber. Dear Christ, are you ever? As a younger man, those questions never would have occurred to him. And if they had, he would simply have brushed them aside. Apparently, Bobbi already had. She was, after all, the one who had mentioned the man on horseback. What do you mean, a man on horseback? I mean us, Guard. But I think I mostly mean you. Bobbi, when I was 25, I burned all the time. When I was 30, I burned some of the time. But the oxygen in here must be getting thin, because now I only burn when I'm drunk. I'm scared to climb up on that horse, Bobbi. If history ever taught me anything, it taught me that horses like to bolt. He shifted on the stump again, and the shotgun followed him. Anderson sat in the kitchen on a stool, the barrels swiveling a bit on the windowsill. Every move Gardner made. He was getting very little of his thoughts. It was frustrating, maddening. She was getting enough to know that Gardner was approaching a decision, and when he made it, Anderson thought she would know what it was. If it was the wrong one, she was going to blow off the back of his head and bury the body in the soft soil at the foot of the garden. Yes, now please. You go play. She would hate to do that, but if she had to, she would. Anderson waiting calmly for a moment. Her mind turned to the faint run of Gardner's thoughts, making a tenuous connection. It would not be long now. 11. What really scares you is the chance to deal from a position of strength for the first time in your miserable, confused life. He sat up straighter, an expression of dismay on his face. It wasn't true, was it? Surely it wasn't. Oh, but Guard, it is. You even root for baseball games that are cataclysmic underdogs. That way you never have to worry about being depressed if one of them blows it in the World Series. It's the same with the candidates and the causes you support, isn't it? Because if your politics never get the chance to be tried out, you never have to worry about finding out what that the new boss is the same as the old boss, do you? I'm not scared. Not of that. Fuck, you're not. A man on horseback. You. Man, that's a laugh. You'd have a heart attack if someone asked you to be a man on a tricycle. Your own personal life has been nothing but a constant effort to destroy every power base you have. Take marriage. Nora was tough. You finally had to shoot her to get rid of her. But when the chips were down, you didn't stick at it, did you? You're a man who manages to rise to every occasion. No, thank you. I already had some. Just have one. I'll give you that. You got yourself fired from your teaching job, thus eliminating another power base. You spent 12 years pouring enough booze into your little spark of talent God gave you to put it out. Now this. You better run, Guard. That's not fair. Honest to God, it's not. No. Is there enough truth in it to make a comeuppance? Maybe. Maybe not. Either way, he discovered that the decision had already been made. He would stick with Bobbi, at least for a while. Do it her way. Bobbi's blithe assurance that everything was just ducky didn't jibe very well with her exhaustion and weight loss. What the ship and the Earth could do to Bobbi, it would probably do to him.
Mom, where can I find the scissors?
I don't know.
Yes, I'm going to.
No, just pull it open at the end.
No, I have to open it.
What had happened, or failed to happen, today proved nothing. He would not have expected all the changes to come at once. Yet the ship, or whatever force emanated from it, had a great capacity to do good. That was the main thing. And well, fuck the Tommyknocker man. Gardner got up and walked toward the house. The sun had gone down. The twilight was turning ashy. His back was stiff. He stretched, standing on his toes, and grimaced as his spine crackled. He looked past the dark, silent shape of the tomcat to the shed door with its new padlock. He thought of going to it, trying to look through one of the dirt-grimed windows, and decided not to. Perhaps he was afraid a white face would pop up inside the dark window, its grin showing a mouthful of filed cannibal teeth and a deadly ring. Hello, Guard. You want to meet some genuine Tommyknockers? Come on in. There's lots of us in here. Gardner shivered. He could almost hear thin, evil fingers scrabbling on the panes. Yes. Too much had happened today and yesterday. His imagination had gotten out. Tonight it would be walk and talk. He didn't know if he should hope for sleep or for it to stay away. 12. Once he was back inside, his uneasiness began to fade. With it went some of his craving for drink. He took off his shirt and then peered into Anderson's room. Bobbi lay just as she had lain before, blankets caught between her dreadful thin legs. One hand thrown up, snoring. Hasn't even moved. Christ, she must be tired. He took a long shower, turning the water up as hot as he dared, with Bobbi Anderson's new water heater that meant barely jogging the knob 5 degrees west of dead cold. When his skin began to turn red, he stepped out into the bathroom, as steamy as London in the grip of a late Victorian-era fog. He toweled, brushed his teeth with a finger. Got to do something about getting some supplies here, he thought, and went to bed. Drifting off, he He found himself thinking again about the last thing Bobbi had said during their discussion. She believed the ship in the earth had begun to affect the townspeople. When he asked for specifics, she grew vague and then changed the subject. Gardner supposed anything was possible in this crazy business. Although the old Frank Garrick place was in the boonies, it was almost exactly in the geographical center of the township itself. There was a Haven village, but that was 5 miles further north. You make it sound as if it was throwing off poison gas, he had said, hoping he didn't sound as uneasy as he felt. Paraquat from space. It came from Agent Orange. Poison gas? Bobbi repeated. She had gone off by herself again, her face so thin now, it's closed and distant. No, not poison gas. Call it fumes if you want to call it anything. But it's more than just the vibration when a person touches it. Gardner said nothing, not wanting to break her mood. Fumes. Not that either, but like fumes. If EPA came in here with sniffers, I don't think they'd find any pollutants at all. If there's any actual physical residue in the air, it's nothing but the tiniest trace. Do you think that's possible, Bobbi? Gardner asked quietly. Yes, I'm not telling you I know that's what's happening, because I don't. I have no inside information. But I think that the very thin layer of the ship's hull, and I mean thin, maybe no more than a single molecule or two in depth, could be oxidizing as I uncover it and the air hits it. That means I'd get the first, heaviest dose, and then it would go with the wind, like fallout. The people in town would get most of it, but most would really mean damn little in this case. Bobbi shifted in her rocker and reached down with her right hand. It was a gesture Gardner had seen her make many times before, and his heart went out to his friend when he saw the look of sorrow cross Bobbi's face. Bobbi put her hand back into her lap. But I'm not sure that's what's going on at all, you know. There's a novel by a man named Peter Straub called Floating Dragon. Have you read it? Gardner had shaken his head. Well, it postulates something similar to your Agent Orange from space, or Paraquat of the gods, or whatever you call it. Gardner smiled. In the story, an experimental chemical is sucked into the atmosphere and falls on a place of suburban Connecticut. This stuff really is poison, a kind of insanity gas. People get in fights for no reason. Some fellow decides to paint his whole house, including the windows, bright pink. A woman jogs until she drops dead of a massive coronary, and so on. There's another novel. This one is called Brainwave, and it is written by... Anderson wrinkled her brow, thinking. Her hand stole down to the right of her rocker again and then came back. Same name as mine, Anderson. Paul Anderson. In that one, the Earth passes through the tail of a comet, and some of the fallout makes animals smarter. The book starts with a rabbit literally reasoning its way out of a trap. Smarter? Gardner echoed. Yes. If you had an IQ of 120 before the Earth went through the comet...
Is this liquid or it needs more time?
It should be fine. You've made it before. Just put your cheese in, honey.
Yeah, but
it should be fine.
You'd 3.5 minutes.
How many minutes did you put it in?
3:30.
There you go. Now add your cheese and stir it up. You'd end up with an IQ of 180. Get it? Well-rounded intelligence. Yes. But the term you used before was idiot savant. Savant. That's the exact opposite of a well-rounded intelligence, isn't it? It's a kind of a bump. Anderson waved this aside. Doesn't matter, she said. Now lying here in bed, drifting off to sleep. Gardner wondered. 13. That night he had a dream. It was simple enough. He was standing in the darkness outside of the shed, between the farmhouse and the garden. To his left, the tomcat was a dark shape. He was thinking exactly what he had been thinking tonight, that he would go over and look in it in one of the windows, And what would he see? Why, the Tommyknockers, of course. But he wasn't afraid. Instead of fear, he felt delighted, relieved, joy. Because the Tommyknockers weren't monsters or cannibals. They were like the elves in that story about the good shoemaker. He would look in through the dirty shed window like a delighted child looking out a bedroom window in the illustration from The Night Before Christmas. And what was Santa Claus? That right jolly old elf, but a big old Tommyknocker in a red suit. And he would see them, laughing and chattering as they sat at a long table, cobbling together power generators and levitating skateboards, televisions which showed mind movies instead of regular ones. He drifted towards the shed, and suddenly it was lighted by the same glare he had seen coming out of Bobbi's modified typewriter. It was as if the shed had turned into some weirdo jack-o'-lantern, only this light was not a warm yellow, but an awful rotten green. It spilled out between the boards. It spilled rays through the knotholes and tattooed evil cat's eyes on the ground. It filled the windows, and now he was afraid, because no friendly little aliens came from space made that light. If cancer had a color, it would be the one that spilled from every chink and crack and knothole and window of Bobbi Anderson's shed. But he drew closer, because in dreams, you can't always help yourself. He drew closer, no longer wanting to see, no more than a kid would want to look out his bedroom window on Christmas Eve and see Santa striding along the snow-covered slope of roof across the way, with a severed head in each gloved hand. That sounds like The Nightmare Before Christmas. The blood from a ragged neck steaming in the cold. Please no. Please no. But he drew closer, and as he entered the haze of green, rock music spilled into his head in a paralyzing, mind-splitting flood. It was George Thorogood and the Destroyers. And he knew that when George started to play the slide guitar, his skull would vibrate for a moment with killing harmonics, and then simply explode like the water glasses in the house he had once told Bobbi about. None of it mattered. The fear mattered, that was all. The fear of the Tommyknockers and Bobbi's shed. He sensed them, could almost smell them, a rich electric smell like ozone and blood, and the weird liquid sloshing sounds. He could hear those even over the music in his head. It sounded like an old-fashioned washing machine, except the sound wasn't water, and the sound was wrong, wrong, wrong. As he stood on his tiptoes to look into the shed, his face as green as the face of a corpse pulled out of quicksand, George Thorogood started to play that slide blues guitar, and Gardner began screaming with pain. And that was when his head exploded and he woke, sitting bolt upright in the double bed in the guest room, his chest covered with sweat, his hands trembling. He lay down again, thinking, God, if you're going to have nightmares about it, take a look in tomorrow. Get your mind easy. He had expected nightmares in the wake of his decision. He lay back down again, thinking that this was only the first, but there were no more dreams that night. The next day he joined Bobbi in the dig. Book 2. You watching?
Thor.
Oh, I was going to say, that's Loki, isn't it? Nope. That's the, Guardian. Tales of Haven. The terrorist got bombed. The president got hit. Security was tight. The Secret Service got lit. And everybody's drunk. Everybody's wasted. Everybody's stoned. And there's nothing gonna change it. Because everybody's drunk. Everybody's wasted. Everybody's drinking on the job. The Rainmakers drinking on the job. Then he ran all the way to town, screaming, "It came out of the sky." Creedence Clearwater Revival came out of the sky. Part 2, Chapter 1, The Town. 1. The town had 4 other names before it became Haven. It began municipal existence in 1816 as Montville Plantation. How loud is it? There you go. It was owned lock, stock, and barrel by a man named Hugh Crane. Ha! Now that's a name I remember from a movie. What was it called? What is it, The Haunting? Or Rose Red? Rose Red. Crane purchased it in 1813 from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, of which Maine was then a province. He had been a lieutenant in the Revolutionary War. The Montville Plantation name was a jibe. Crane's father had never ventured east of Dover in his life, and remained a loyal Tory when the break with the colonies came. He ended life as a peer of the realm, the 12th Earl of Montville. As his eldest son, Hugh Crane would have been the 13th Earl of Montville. Instead, his enraged father disinherited him. Not put out of countenance in the slightest, Crane went about cheerfully, calling himself the first Earl of Central Maine, sometimes the Duke of Nowhere at all. The tract of land which Crane called Montville Plantation consisted of about 22,000 acres. When Crane petitioned and was granted incorporated status, Montville Plantation became the 193rd town to be so incorporated in the Massachusetts province of Maine. Crane bought the land because good timber was plentiful, and Derry, where timber would be floated downriver to the sea, was only 20 miles away. How cheap was the area of land which eventually became Haven? Hugh Crane had bought the whole shebang for the equivalent of £1,800. Of course, pound went a lot further in those days. 2. When Hugh Crane died in 1826, there was 103 residents of Montville Plantation. Take it down one notch, Nick. There you go. Thank you. Loggers swelled the population to twice that for 6 or 7 months of the year. But they didn't really count, because they took their little bit of money into Derry, and it was in Derry that they usually settled when they grew too old to work the woods anymore. In those days, too old to work the woods anymore usually meant about 25. Nevertheless, in 1926, the settlement, which would eventually become Haven Village, had begun to grow up along the muddy road leading north toward Derry and Bangor. Whatever you call it, and eventually it became, except in the memory of the oldest old-timers, like Dave Rutledge, plain old Route 9. That road was one the loggers had to take when they went to Derry at the end of each month to spend their pay drinking and whoring. They saved their serious spending for the big town, but most were willing to bide long enough at Cooter's Tavern and Lodging House to lay the dust with a beer or two on the way. This wasn't much, but it was enough to make the place a successful little business. The General Mercantile across the road, owned and operated by Harim Cooter's nephew, was less successful, but still a marginally profitable business. In 1828, a barber shop and small surgery, owned and operated by Harim Cooter's cousin, opened next to the General Mercantile. In those days, it was not unusual to stroll into this lively, growing establishment and see a logger reclining in one of the three chairs, having the hair on his head cut, the cut on his arm stitched, and a couple of large bloodsuckers from a jar by the cigarette box reposing above each closed eye, turning from gray to red as they swelled, simultaneously protecting against any infection from the cut and taking away that malady which was then known as aching brains. In 1830, the hostelry and feed store, owned by Hiram Cooter's brother George, opened at the south end of the village. In 1831, Montville Plantation became Cootersville. No one was very surprised. Cootersville it remained until 1864, when the name had changed to Montgomery in honor of Ellis Montgomery, a local boy who had fallen at Gettysburg, where, some say, the 20th Maine preserved the Union all by itself. The change seemed a fine idea. After all, the town's one remaining Cooter, crazy old Albion, had gone bankrupt and committed suicide 2 years before. In the years following the end of the Civil War, a craze as inexplicable as most crazes swept the state. This craze was not for hoop skirts or sideburns. It was a craze of giving small towns classical names. Hence, there is Sparta, Maine, Carthage in Athens, and of course, there was Troy right next door. In 1878, the residents of the town voted to change the town's name yet again, this time from Montgomery to Ilium. This provoked a tearful tirade at a town meeting from the mother of Ellis Montgomery. In truth, the tirade was more senile than ringing, the hero's mother being by then full of years, 75 of them to be exact. Town legend has it that the townsfolk listened patiently, a little guiltily, and that the decision might even have been recanted. Mrs. Montgomery was surely right, some thought, when she said that 14 years was hardly an immortal memory. Her dead son had been promised at the name-changing ceremonies which had taken place on July 4th, 1864. And if the good lady's bladder hadn't picked that particular moment to let go, she was helped from the town meeting hall. Oh, they might have recanted if her bladder hadn't let go. She was helped from the town meeting hall, still ranting about ungrateful Philistines who would rue the day. Montgomery became Ilium just the same. 22 years passed. 3. Came a fast-talking revival preacher who for some reason bypassed Derry and elected instead to spread his tent in Ilium. He went by the name of Colson, but Myrtle Duplessis, Haven's self-appointed historian, eventually became convinced that Colson's real name was Cooter, and that he was the illegitimate son of Albion Cooter. Whoever he was, he won most of the Christians in town over to his own lively version of the faith. By the time the corn was ready for picking, much to the despair of Mrs. Hartley, who ministered to the Methodists of Ilium and Troy, and Mr. Hartley and Mr. Crowell, who looked after the spiritual welfare of Baptists in Ilium, Troy, Etna, and Unity. The joke in those days was that Emery Crowell's parsonage belonged to the town of Troy, but his piles belonged to God. Nevertheless, their exhortations were voices crying in the wilderness. Preacher Colson's congregation continued to grow, as that well-nigh perfect summer of 1900 drew close to conclusion. To call the crops of that year bumpers was to poor-mouth them. The thin northern New England earth, usually as stingy as Scrooge, that year poured forth a bounty which seemed never-ending. Mr. Crowell, the Baptist, whose piles belonged to God, grew depressed and silent, and 3 years later hung himself in the cellar of the Troy parsonage. Wow. And suicide is against the Bible. Heck yeah. And Mr. Hartley, the Methodist minister, grew ever more alarmed by the evangelical fervor which was sweeping Ilium like a cholera epidemic. Perhaps this was because Methodists are, under ordinary circumstances, the most undemonstrative worshippers of God. They listen not to sermons, but to messages, pray mostly in decorous silence, and consider the only proper places for congregation spoken amens to be at the end of the Lord's Prayer and those few hymns not sung by the choir. But now these previously undemonstrative people were doing everything from speaking in tongues to holy rolling. Next, Mr. Hartley sometimes said, they will be handling snakes. The Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday meetings in the revival tent beside Derry Road became steadily louder, wilder, and more emotionally explosive. If it was happening in a carnival tent, they'd call it hysteria. He told Fred Perry, a church deacon, and his only close friend, one night over glasses of sherry in the church rectory, because it's happening in a revival tent, they can get away with calling it Pentecostal fire. Reverend Hartley's suspicions of Colson were aptly justified in the course of time, but before then, Colson fled, having harvested a goodly crop of cold cash and warm women instead of pumpkins and taters. And before then, he put his lasting stamp on the town by changing its name for the final time. His sermon on the hot August night began with the subject of the harvest as a symbol of God's great reward, and then moved on to the subject of this very town. By this time, Colson had stripped off his frock coat. His sweat-soaked hair had tumbled in his eyes. The sisters had commenced getting down in the amen corner, although it would be yet a while before the speaking in tongues and the holy rolling got going. I consider this town sanctified, Colson told his audience, gripping the sides of his pulpit. Did you turn it up? Thank you. I'm trying to read and I can't read over that, okay? Gripping the sides of his pulpit with his big hands. He might have considered it sanctified for some reason other than the fact that his honored self had chosen it in which to spread his tent, not to mention his seed. But if so, he didn't say so. I consider it a haven. I'm surprised he watched 45, about 20 minutes of it. Normal. I consider it a haven. Yes, I have found a haven here that reminds me of my haven home. A lovely land, maybe not so different from the one Adam and Eve knew before they were picking fruit from the tree they should have left alone. Sanctified, Richard Colson bellowed. Years after, there were members of his congregation who still spoke admiringly of how that man could shout for Jesus, scoundrel or not. Amen, the congregation cried back. The night, though warm, was perhaps not quite warm enough to completely explain the blushes on so many feminine cheeks and brows. Such flushes had become common since Preacher Colson came to town. This town is nothing short of a glory to God. Hallelujah, the congregation yelled jubilantly. Breasts heaved, eyes sparkled, tongues slipped out in wet lips. This town has got a promise, Preacher Colson shouted, now striding rapidly back and forth, occasionally flicking his black locks back from his forehead with a quick snap that showed his cleanly corded neck to good advantage. This town has got a promise, and that promise is the fullness of the harvest, and that promise shall be fulfilled. Praise Jesus. Wilson came back to the pulpit, grasped it, looked out at them forbiddingly. So why you want to have a town which promises the harvest of God and a haven of God? Why you want to have a town that speaks of those things named after some dago is more than I can figure out, brethren. Must have been the devil working somewhere in the last generation, is all I can figure. Talk about changing the town's name from Ilion to Haven began the very next day. The Reverend Mr. Crowell protested the change listlessly. The Reverend Mr. Hartley much more strongly. Ilium's selectmen were neutral, except to point out that it would cost the town $20 to change the papers of incorporation on file in Augusta, and probably another $20 to change the municipal road signs, not to mention the letterheads on town documents and stationery. Long before the March town meeting, on which Article 14, see if the town will approve changing the name of Incorporated Main Town number 193 from Ilium to Haven, was discussed and voted on. Preacher Colson had literally folded his tent and stolen into the night. Said folding and stealing took place on the night September 7th. Following what Colson had for weeks been calling the Great Harvest Home Revival of 1900. He'd been making it clear for the last month that he considered it the most important meeting he would hold in town this year. Perhaps the most important meeting he ever held. Even if he should settle here, something he felt more and more often that God was calling him to do, and didn't that news just make the ladies' hearts go pity-pat? It was, he said, to be the great love offering to the loving God who had provided the town with such a wonderful, growing season of harvest. Olson did some harvesting of his own. He began by cajoling the attendees to give the largest love offering of his stay, and finished by plowing and planting not 2, not 4, but 6 young maidens in the field behind the tent after the meeting. Oh, then. Men love to talk big, but I guess most of them pack derringers in their pants no matter how big they talk. Old Duke Barfield said, "Please stop," in the barber shop one evening. If there had been a stinkiest man in town contest, Old Duke would have won hands down. He smelled like a pickled egg that has spent a month in a mud puddle. Ew. He was listening too, but at a distance, and upwind. If there was a wind to make this possible. I heard 'em men with double-barrel shotguns in their pants, and I reckon it's so every once and again. And once I ever heard tell o' some fella had him a 3-shot pistol, but that fucker Colson's the only man I ever heard of who came packing a 6-shooter. 3 of Preacher Colson's conquests were virgins before the invasion of the Pentecostal pecker. The love offering that night in the late summer of 1900 was indeed generous, although the barbershop gossips differed on just how generous the monetary part of it had been. All agreed that, even before the Great Harvest Home Revival, where the preaching had gone on until 10, the gospel singing until midnight, and the field fucking until well past 2, there had been a great outpouring of hard cash. Some also pointed out that Colson hadn't had many expenses during his stay either. The women damn near fought for the privilege of bringing him his meals. The fellow who now owned the hostelry made him the long-term loan of a buggy, and of course, no one at all charged him for his nightly entertainments. On the morning of September 8th, tent and preacher were gone. He had harvested well and seeded with equal success. For January 1st, town meeting in the late March 1901, 9 illegitimate children, 3 girls and 6 boys, were born in the area. All 9 of these love children bore a remarkable resemblance, each to the other. 6 had blue eyes, and all were born with lusty crops of black hair. The barbershop gossips, and no group of men on earth can so successfully marry logic and prurience as these idlers farting into wicker chairs as they roll cigarettes. Please stop. Hi, babe. I thought you were Nick. No, he's been down here goofing off and messing around and turning the TV up and... Excuse you, was that necessary? Go play with Dad. Don't hit me in the head. Ow. Huh? I still have another hour. Maybe. But it didn't help that Nick... Can you please hold on, because while I'm talking, I cannot hear you. Be right back. All right. Let me know if you come back up. My hair still wants to fall. Sorry, it was my husband. That's all. All right. There we were. My husband was going by. And I thought it was my son. And here my husband has got the tape measure and he's pointing it down to see if he can get it in the cam. Goofball. It's not that I mind people bugging me, but my son does it just to annoy me. Sometimes it's frustrating. Sometimes it's not. It's a mom. It happens. The barbershop gossips. And no group of men on earth can so successfully marry logic and prurience as these idlers farting into wicker chairs as they roll cigarettes and drown brown bullets of tobacco juice into tin spittoons, also pointed out that it was a hard telling just how many young girls had left to visit relatives downstate in New Hampshire, or even all the way down to Massachusetts. It was also pointed out that quite a few married women in the area had given birth between January and March. Okay, what? It wasn't in September then, because that's not even 9 months, so that didn't even make sense. Anyway, about those women who knew for sure, but the barbershop gossips, of course, knew what had happened on March 29th, after Faith Clarendon gave birth to a bouncing 8-pound baby boy. A wild, wet northerner was whooping around the eaves of the Clarendon house, dropping 1901's last large budget of snow until November. Cora simmered, the midwife who had delivered the baby, was in a half doze by the kitchen stove, waiting for her husband Irwin to finally make his way through the storm and take her home. She saw Paul Clarendon approach the crib where his new son lay. It was on the other side of the stove, in the corner which was warmest, and Stan looking fixedly down at the new baby for over an hour. Cora made a dreadful error in mistaking Paul Clarendon's fixed stare for wonder and love. Her eyes drifted close. When she awoke from her doze, Paul Clarendon was standing over the crib with a straight razor in his hand. I'm going to give a very, very, very big disclaimer, or not even a disclaimer, a warning. If you cannot figure out what is going to happen next, if you do not want to hear anything about children and death, my suggestion is to leave now, mute, leave the room, come back in a little bit, because this is not going to be an easy part to read. I read ahead a little bit before I continue. Okay? This book gets dark, and this is probably the darkest so far. Okay? When she woke from her doze, Paul Clarendon was standing over the crib, the straight razor in his hand. He seized the baby by its thick crop of blue-black hair, and before Cora could unlock her throat to scream, he had cut its throat. He left the room without a word. A moment later, she heard wet gargling sounds coming from the bedroom. When a terrified Irwin Simard finally found the courage to enter the Clarendon bedroom, he found man and wife on the bed, hands joined. Clarendon had cut his wife's throat, laid down beside her, grasped her right hand with his left, and then cut his own. All this happened 2 days after the town had voted to change its name. If you need a few moments, that is fine. Pause, walk away, come back. You're on live. You can always come back and rewatch. That is the darkest thing so far that I've read. 4. The Reverend Mr. Hartley was dead set against changing the town's name to one suggested by a man who had proved to be a thief, fornicator, false prophet, an all-around snake in the grass. He had said as much from his pulpit and had noted the agreeing nods from his parishioners with an almost vindictive pleasure. That was really not much like him. He came to the town meeting, held on March 27, 1901, confident that Article 14 would be resoundingly voted down. He was not even troubled by the brevity of discussion between the town clerk's reading of the article and head selectman Luther Revol's laconic, "What's your pleasure, people?" If he had had the slightest inkling, Hartley would have spoken vehemently, even furiously, for the only time in his life. He never had so much as an inkling. "Those in favor signify by saying aye," Luther Revol said, and at the solid, if not very passionate aye that shook the roof beams, Hartley felt as if he had been punched in the gut. He stared around wildly, but it was too late. The strength of the eye had taken him so totally by surprise that he had no idea how many from his own congregation had turned on him and voted the other way. "Wait," he said aloud in a strangled voice that nobody heard. "Those opposed?" Scattered, staggered straggle of nays. Hartley tried to scream his. The only sound that escaped his throat was a nonsense syllable. "Ech." "Motion's carried," Luther Revol said. "Now, Article 15. The Reverend Mr. Hartley suddenly felt warm, much too warm. He felt, in fact, as though he might faint. He pushed his way through standing throngs of men in red and black checked shirts and muddy flannel pants, through clouds of acrid smoke puffed from corn cobs and cheap cigars. How the heck do you puff a corn cob? You make a corn cob pipe? Like, do you take the corn cob and make a pipe out of it? I can't even imagine. I mean, I see people make stuff out of wood, so yeah, I guess I can't imagine, but it's still weird. He still felt faint, but now he felt that he might also vomit before he fainted. A week later, he would not be able to understand the depth of his shock. So deep it was really horror. A year later, he would not even acknowledge that he had felt such an emotion. He stood on the top of the top town hall step, snatching great swoops, 40-degree air, clutching the handrail in a death grip, and looking out across fields of melting snow. In places it had now drawn back enough to show the muddy earth beneath. And he thought with vicious crudity, that was also unlike him, that the fields looked like splotches of shit on the tail of a nightshirt. For the first and only time, he felt a bitter envy for Bradley Coulson, or Cooter, that was his real name. Coulson had run away from Ilium. Oh, beg your pardon, from Haven. He had run. Now Donald Hartley found himself wishing he could do the same. Why did they do it? Why? They knew what he was. They knew. So why did they? Strong, warm hand fell on his back. He turned and saw his good friend, Fred Perry. Fred's long, homely face looked distressed and concerned, and Hartley felt an unwilling smile cross his face. "Don, are you all right?" Fred Perry asked. "Yes. I had a moment in there when I felt lightheaded. It was the vote. I didn't expect it." "Nor I," Fred replied. "My parishioners were part of it," Hartley said. "They had to have been. It was so loud. They had to have been, don't you think?" "Well," The Reverend Mr. Hartley smiled a little. I apparently do not know as much about human nature as I thought I did. Come back in, Dawn. They're going to take up paving Ridge Road. I think I'll stay out a while longer, Hartley said, and think about human nature. He paused, and just as Fred Perry was turning to go back in, the Reverend Mr. Donald Hartley asked, almost appealed, "Do you understand, Fred? Do you understand why they did it? You're almost 10 years older than I. Do you understand it?" And Fred Perry, who had shouted out his own "I" from behind a curled fist, shook his head and said no. He didn't understand at all. He did like the Reverend Mr. Hartley. He did respect the Reverend Mr. Hartley. But in spite of those things, and maybe, just maybe, because of them, he had taken a mean and spiteful pleasure in voting for a name suggested by Coulson. Coulson the false prophet, Coulson the confidence man, Coulson the thief, Coulson the seducer. No, Fred Perry did not understand human nature at all. Okay. Chapter 2. Becca Paulson. I don't know who this is. Part 1. Rebecca Bouchard Paulson was married to Joe Paulson, one of Haven's 2 mail carriers and 1/3 of Haven's postal staff. And now I remember. Now I know who she is. Okay. Joe was cheating on his wife, something Bobbi Anderson knew already. Now Becca Paulson knew it as well. She had known it for the last 3 days, Jesus told her. In the last 3 days or so, Jesus told her the most amazing, terrible, distressing things imaginable. They sickened her. They destroyed her sleep. They were destroying her sanity. But weren't they also sort of wonderful? Boy, howdy. And would she stop listening? Maybe just tip Jesus over on his face, or scream at him to shut up? Absolutely not. For one thing, there was a grisly sort of compulsion in knowing the things Jesus told her. For another, he was the Savior. Jesus was on top of Paulson's Sony TV. I think I know where this is going. I'm going to find out. Let's find out. He had been there for just 6 years. Before that, he had rested atop 2 zeniths. Becca estimated that Jesus had been in roughly the same spot for about 16 years. Jesus was represented in lifelike 3D. There was a picture of him that Becca's older sister, Corrine, who lived in Portsmouth, had given them as a wedding present. When Joe commented that Becca's sister was a little on the cheap side, once Becca told him to hush up. Not that she was terribly surprised. You couldn't expect a man like Joe to understand the fact that you couldn't put a price tag on true beauty. In the picture, Jesus was dressed in a simple white robe and holding a shepherd's staff. Christ on Becca's TV combed his hair a little bit like Elvis after Elvis got out of the army. What? Yes, he looked quite a little bit like Elvis in GI Blues. Guess I don't know. His eyes were blown and mild. Behind him, in perfect perspective, sheep as white as the linens in TV soap commercials, trailed off and over the horizon. Okay, this must be. It's got to be a picture. Trailed off and over the horizon. Becca and Corrine had grown up on a sheep farm in New Gloucester, and Becca. Oh, for Gloucester. The Tailor of Gloucester. Peter Rabbit thing from Beatrix Potter. I'm trying. Anyway, a sheep farm in New Gloucester, and Becca knew from personal experience that sheep were never that white and uniformly woolly. No, they weren't. Like little fair weather clouds fallen to earth. But she reasoned, if Jesus could turn water into wine and bring the dead back to life, there was no reason at all why he couldn't make the shit caked around a bunch of lambs' rumps disappear if he wanted to. A couple of times Joe had tried to move that picture off the TV. I knew it was a picture. And she supposed that now she knew why. Oh, yes, sirree. Boy, howdy. Joe, of course, had his trumped up tales. It doesn't seem right to have Jesus on top of the television while we're watching Magnum or Miami Vice, he'd say. Why not put it on your bureau, Becca? Or I'll tell you what. Why not put it up in your bureau until Sunday, and then you bring it down and put it back while you watch Jimmy Swaggart and Jack Van Imp? I'll bet Jesus likes Jimmy Swaggart a hell of a lot better than he likes Miami Vice. She refused. Another time he said, when it's my turn to have a Thursday night poker game, the guys don't like it. No one wants to have Jesus Christ looking at him while he tries to draw an inside straight. Sorry. Maybe they feel uncomfortable because they know gambling's the devil's work, Becca said. We just went from grim and gory to laughing. All kinds of emotions. Joe, a good poker player, bridled. Then it was the devil's work bought you your blow dryer and that garnet ring you like swell, said. Better take 'em back for refunds and give the money to the Salvation Army. I think I got the receipts in my den. So she allowed Joe to turn the 3D picture of Jesus around on one Thursday night a month that he had his dirty, talking, beer swilling friends in to play poker. And that was all. And now she knew the real reason he had wanted to get rid of that picture. He must have had the idea all along that the picture might be a magic picture. Oh, she supposed sacred was a better word. Magic was for pagans, headhunters, and cannibals, and Catholics, and people like that. Since when do Catholics have magic? But they almost came to the same thing, didn't they? Anyway, Joe must have sensed that picture was special, that it would be the means by which his sin would be found out. Oh, she supposed she had known something was going on. He was never after her at night any more. And while that was something of a relief, sex was just just as her mother had told her it would be. Nasty, brutish, sometimes painful, always humiliating. She had also smelled perfume on his collar from time to time, and that was not a relief at all. She supposed she could have ignored the connection. The fact that the pawnings had stopped at the same time that occasional smell of perfume started showing up in his collars. And definitely, if the picture of Jesus on top of the Sony hadn't begun to speak on July 7th, she could even have ignored the third factor. About the same time, the pawnings had stopped and the perfume smells had begun. Old Charlie Estabrook had retired from the post office, and a woman named Nancy Voss had come up from the Augusta post office to take his place. She guessed that the Voss woman, whom Becca now thought of simply as the hussy, was perhaps 5 years older than she and Joe, which would make her around 50. But she was trim, well kept 50. She was a trim, well kept 50. Becca would admit she herself had put on a little weight, going from 126 to 203, most of that since Byron, their only chick, had left home. Oh. She could have ignored it, would have ignored it, perhaps even have come to tolerate it with relief, if the hussy enjoyed the animalism of sexual congress, with its gruntings and thrustings and that final squirt of sticky stuff that smelled faintly like codfish and looked like cheap dish detergent. Then it only proved the hussy was little more than an animal herself. Also, it freed Becca of the tiresome, if ever more occasional, obligation. She could have ignored it, that was. The picture of Jesus hadn't spoken. It happened for the first time at just past 3 in the afternoon on Thursday. Anybody have an idea of how the picture's talking? Becca was coming back into the living room from the kitchen with a little snack, half a coffee cake, and a beer stein filled with cherry the Rex. Oh, that is. To watch General Hospital. She could no longer really believe that Luke and Laura would ever come back, and she was not able to completely give up hope. But she was not able to completely give up hope. Let's be people. She was bending down to turn on the TV when Jesus said, "Becca, Joe is putting it in that hussy down at the P.O. just about every lunch hour and sometimes after quitting time, too. Once he was so randy, he put it in her while he was supposed to be helping her sort the mail. And do you know what? She never said, 'At least wait until I get the first class took care of.' And that's not all," Jesus said. He walked halfway across the picture, his robe fluttering around his ankles, sat down on a rock that jutted from the ground. He held his staff between his knees and looked at her grimly. "There's a lot going on in Haven. You won't believe the half of it." Becca screamed again and fell to her knees. "My Lord!" she shrieked. One of her knees landed squarely on her piece of coffee cake, which was roughly the size and thickness of the family Bible. That's a big piece. Squirting raspberry filling into the face of Ozzy the cat, who had crept out from under the stove to see what was going on. Bible, that's huge. That's got me now. Since when does coffee cake has raspberry? Ugh. My Lord, Becca continued to shriek. Ozzy ran hissing for the kitchen, where he crawled under the stove again, with red goo dripping from his whiskers. I'm sorry. I can just imagine a cat square in the face, raspberry everywhere, running underneath. Drip, 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 drip. He stayed there for the rest of the day. Well, none of the Paulsons was ever good for much, Jesus said. The sheep wandered toward him and he whacked it away, using his staff with an absent-minded impatience that reminded Becca, even in her current frozen state, of her late father. The sheep went, rippling slightly because of the 3D effect. It disappeared. This whole thing has got me laughing. It disappeared. Actually seemed to curve as it went off the edge of the picture. That was just an optical illusion, she felt sure. "No, sir," Jesus declared. "Joe's great-uncle was a murderer, as you well know, Becca. Murdered his son, his wife, and then himself." Ooh. That would be the ones we just talked about. "And when he came up here, do you know what he said? What we said? No room. That's what we said." Jesus leaned forward, propped on his staff. "Go see Mr. Splitfoot down below," we said. "You'll have your Haven home, all right. But you may find your new landlord asks a hell of a high rent and never turns back the heat," we said. Incredibly, Jesus winked at her. And that was when Becca fled shrieking from the house. I'm sorry. If y'all ain't laughing, man. 2. She stopped in the backyard, panting, her mousy blonde hair hanging in her face, her heart beating so fast that it frightened her. No one had heard her shrieks and carryings on, thank the Lord. She and Joe lived far out in the on the Nista Road, and her nearest neighbors were the Brodskys, who lived in that slutty trailer. The Brodskys were half a mile away. That was good. Anyone who had heard her would have thought there was a crazy woman down at the Paulsons. Well, there is, isn't there? If you think that picture started to talk, why, you must be crazy. Daddy'd beat you 3 shades of blue for saying such a thing. 1 for lying, 1 for believing it, a 3rd for raising your voice. Becca's pictures don't talk. Becca, pictures don't talk. No, nor did it. Another voice spoke up suddenly. That voice came out of your own head, Becca. I don't know how it could be. How you could know such things. That's what happened. You made that picture of Jesus talk your own self. Like Edgar Bergen used to make Charlie McCarthy talk on the Ed Sullivan Show. Somehow that idea seemed more frightening, more downright crazy, than the idea that the picture itself had spoken. And she refused to allow it mental house room. After all, miracles happened every day. That was that Mexican fellow who had found a picture of the Virgin Mary. There was that Mexican fellow who found a picture of the Virgin Mary baked into an enchilada or something. There were those miracles at Lourdes, not to mention those children who had made the headlines of one of the tabloids. They had cried rocks. Those were bona fide miracles. The children who wept rocks was, admittedly, a rather gritty one. As uplifting as a Pat Robinson sermon. Hearing voices was just nuts. That's what happened. And you've been hearing voices for quite a while now, haven't you? You've been hearing his voice, Joe's. And that's where it came from. From Jesus, but from Joe. No, Becca whimpered. I ain't heard any voices in my head. She stood by her clothesline in the backyard, looking blankly off toward the woods on the other side of the Nista Road. They were hazy in the heat. Less than half a mile into those woods, as the crows flew, Bobbi Anderson and Jim Gardner were steadily unearthing more and more of a titanic fossil in the earth. Crazy, her dead father's implacable voice called in her head. Crazy with the heat. Come on over here, Becca Bockard. I'm gonna beat you 3 shades of blister blue for that crazy talk. I ain't heard no voices in my head, Becca moaned. That picture really did talk, I swear. I can't do ventriloquism. Better the picture. If it was the picture, it was a miracle, and miracles came from God. A miracle could drive you nuts. Dear God knew she felt like she was going nuts right now. But it didn't mean you were crazy to start with. Hearing voices in your head, however, or believing that you could hear other people's thoughts. Becca looked down and saw blood gushing from her left knee. She shrieked again and ran back into the house to call the doctor, medics. Somebody, anybody. She was in the living room again, pawing at the dial with the phone to her ear when Jesus said, That's just raspberry filling from your coffee cake, Becca. Why don't you just cool it before you have a heart attack? She looked at the Sony, the telephone receiver filled, falling to the table with a clunk. Jesus was still sitting on the rock outcropping. It looked as though he had crossed his legs. It was really surprising how much he looked like her father, only he didn't seem forbidding, ready to be angry at at a moment's notice. He was looking at her with a kind of exasperated patience. Try it. See if I'm not right, Jesus said. She touched her knee gently, wincing, anticipating pain. There was none. She saw the seeds in the red stuff and relaxed. She licked the raspberry fillings off her fingers. Also, Jesus said, you have got to get these ideas about hearing voices and going crazy out of your head. It's just me. And I can talk to anyone I want to, any way I want to. Because you're the Savior, Becca whispered. Right, Jesus said. He looked down, below him, on the screen. A couple of animated salad bowls were dancing in anticipation of a Hidden Valley Ranch dressing, which they were about to receive. And I'd like you to please turn that crap off if you don't mind. You can't talk with that thing running. Also, it makes my feet tingle. Becca approached the Sony and turned it off. My lord, she whispered. 3. That Sunday afternoon, Joe Paulson was laying fast asleep in the backyard hammock with Ozzie the cat zonked out on Joe's ample stomach. Becca stood in the living room, holding the curtain back and looking at Joe, sleeping in the hammock, dreaming of his hussy, no doubt, dreaming of throwing her down in a great pile of catalogs and Woolco circulars, and then, how would Joe and his piggy poker buddies put it, putting the shoes to her? She was holding the curtain with her left hand because she had a handful of square 9-volt batteries in her right. She took the batteries into the kitchen, where she was assembling something in the kitchen on the kitchen table. Jesus had told her to make it. She told Jesus she couldn't make things. She was clumsy. Her daddy had always told her so. She thought of adding how excuse me, of how he sometimes told her he was surprised she could wipe her own butt without an instruction manual, and then decided that wasn't the sort of thing you told the Savior. Jesus told her not to be a fool. If she could follow a recipe, she could build this little thing. She was delighted to find that he was absolutely right. It was not only easy, it was fun. More fun than cooking, certainly. She had never really had the knack for it, ever, either. Her cakes fell, and her breads never rose. She had begun this little thing yesterday, working with the toaster, the motor from her old Hamilton Beach blender, and a funny board full of electronics things, which had come from the back of an old radio in the shed. She thought she would be done long before Joe woke up and came in to watch the Red Sox game on TV at 2 o'clock. She picked up this little blowtorch and lit it deftly with a kitchen match. She would have laughed a week ago if you'd told her she would be working with a propane torch now. But it was easy. Jesus told her exactly how and where to solder the wires to the electronics board and the old radio. That wasn't all Jesus had told her during the last 3 days. He had told her things that murdered her sleep, that made her afraid to go into the village and do her shopping, lest her guilty knowledge show on her face. I'll always know when you done something wrong, Becca, her father had told her, because you ain't got the kind of face and keep a secret. That had, for the first time in her life, made her lose her appetite. Joe, totally bound in his work, the Red Sox, and his hussy, noticed hardly anything amiss, although he had seen Becca gnawing her fingernails the other night as they watched Hill Street Blues, and nail-biting was something she had never done before. It was, in fact, one of the things she nagged him about. Joe Paulson considered this for all of 12 seconds before looking back at the Sony TV and losing himself in dreams of Nancy Voss's heavyweight breasts. Among others, there were a few of the things Jesus told her. These were a few of the things Jesus told her, causing Becca to sleep poorly, to begin biting her fingernails at an advanced age of 45. In 1973, Moss Harlington, one of Joe's poker buddies, had murdered his father. They had been hunting deer in Greenville, and it had suddenly been one of those tragic accidents. But the shooting of Abel Harlington had been no accident. Moss simply laid up behind a fallen tree with his rifle and waited until his father splashed across a small stream about 50 yards down the hill from where Moss was. Moss caught his father as easily as a clay duck in a shooting gallery. He thought he had killed his father for money. Moss's business, Big Ditch Construction, had 2 notes falling due with 2 different banks within 6 weeks' time, and neither would extend because of the other. Moss went to Abel but his dad refused to help, although he could afford to. So Moss shot his father and inherited a pot of money after the county coroner handed down a verdict of death by misadventure. The notes were paid, and Moss Harrington really believed, except perhaps in his deepest dreams, that he had committed murder for gain. The real motive had been something else, far in the past. When Moss was 10 and his brother Emery 7, Abel's wife went south to Rhode Island for one whole winter. Her brother had died suddenly, and his wife needed help getting on her feet. While their mother was gone, there were several incidents of buggery at the Harlington place. The buggery stopped when the boy's mother came back, and the incidents were never repeated. Moss had forgotten all about them. He never remembered laying awake in the dark anymore, laying awake in mortal terror, watching the doorway of the shadow of his father. He had absolutely no recollection of lying with his mouth pressed against his forearm, salty tears of shame and rage squeezing out of his hot eyes and coursing down his cold face to his mouth as Abel Harrington again. I'm going to give a warning, disclaimer, a theme. We are going to add a warning for incest and rape of children. So if you cannot handle that, please leave for a few minutes, mute for a few minutes, and then come back. All right. Salty tears of shame and rage squeezing out of his hot eyes and coursing down his cold face to his mouth as Abel Harlington slathered lard onto his cock and slid it up his son's back door with a grunt and a sigh. It had all made so little impression on Moss that he could not remember biting his arm until it bled to keep from crying out. And he certainly could not remember Emery's breathless bird cries from the next bed. Please, Daddy, no, Daddy, please, not me tonight, please, Daddy. Children, of course, forget very easily, but some memory might have lingered, because when Moss Harrington actually pulled the trigger on the buggering son of a whore, as the echoes first rolled away and then rolled back, finally disappearing into the great forest silence of the up Maine wilderness, Moss whispered, "Not you, Em, not tonight." Alice Kimball, who taught at the Haven Grammar School, was a lesbian. Jesus told Becca this on Friday, not long after the lady herself, looking large and solid and respectable in a green pantsuit, had stopped by collecting for the American Cancer Society. Darla Gaines, the pretty 17-year-old girl who had brought the Sunday paper, had half an ounce of bitchin' reefer between the mattress and box spring of her bed. Jesus told Becca this right after Darla had come on Saturday to collect for the last 5 weeks. $3 plus a 50-cent tip Becca now wished she had withheld. And that she and her boyfriend smoked the reefer in Darla's bed before having intercourse. Only they called having intercourse doing the horizontal bob. They smoked reefer and did the horizontal bob almost every weekday afternoon from 2:30 until 3 or so. Darla's parents both worked in splendid shoe and dairy, and they didn't get home until well past 4. Hank Buck, another of Joe's poker cronies, worked at a large supermarket in Bangor and hated his boss so much that a year ago he had put half a box of X-Lax in the man's chocolate shake. When the boss had sent Hank out to get lunch at McDonald's one day. The boss had had something rather more spectacular than a bowel movement. At 3:15 that day, he had done something in his pants that was the equivalent of a shit A-bomb. The A-bomb, or S-bomb, if you preferred, had gone off as he was slicing lunch meat in the deli of Paul's Down East supermarket. Hank managed to keep a straight face until quitting time. But by the time he got into his car to go home, he was laughing so hard he almost shit his own pants. Twice he had to pull off the road. He got laughing so hard. Laughed, Jesus told Becca. What do you think of that? Becca thought it was a low down, mean trick. Such things were only the beginning, it seemed. Jesus knew something unpleasant and upsetting about everyone Becca came in contact with, it seemed. She couldn't live with such an awful outpouring. She couldn't live without it either. One thing was certain. He had to do something about it. You are, Jesus said. He spoke from behind her, from the picture on top of the Sony. Of course he did. The idea that his voice was coming from inside her own head, that she was somehow reading people's thoughts. That was only a dreadful passing illusion, it must be. The alternative was horrifying. Satan, witchcraft. Fact, Jesus said, confirming his existence with that dry, no-nonsense voice. So like her father's. You're almost done with this part. Just solder that red wire to that point to the left of the long doohickey. No, not there. There. Good girl. Not too much solder, mind. It's like rice cream. Or Brillo cream. Excuse me, Brill cream. Becca, a little dollop will do ya. Strange hearing Jesus talk about Brillo cream. Brillo cream. I know I've heard it before. Oh, it's a hair gel. It's a hair gel, by the way it sounds. Oh, that's my basement. Okay. 4. Joe woke up at 1:45, tossed Ozzy off his lap, strolled to the back of his lawn, brushing cat hairs off his t-shirt, and had a comfortable whiz into the poison ivy back there. Then he headed into the house. Yankees and Red Sox. Great. He opened the fridge, glancing briefly at the snippets of wire on the counter and wondering just what the hell that dim-ball Becca had been up to. But mostly he dismissed it. He was thinking of Nancy Voss. He was wondering what it would feel like to squirt off between Nancy's tits. He thought maybe Monday he'd find out. He squabbled with her. Christ. Sometimes they squabbled like a couple of dogs in August. Seems like it wasn't just them. Everyone seemed short-fused lately. But when it came to fucking, son of a bitch. He hadn't been so randy since he was 18, and she was the same way. Seemed like neither of them could get enough. He'd even squirted in the night a couple of times. It was like he was 16 again. He grabbed a quart of Bud and headed toward the living room. Boston was almost certainly going to win today. He had the odds figured at 8-5. Lately, he seemed to have an amazing head for odds. There was a guy down in Augusta who'd take bets, and Joe had made almost $500 in the last 3 weeks. I want some. Don't give it all to them. I want some. Oh, good. Yeah, do it in small pieces, and don't be afraid of getting your fingers chewed off. If you do it like this, they have to do it slowly, and if they don't, you pull it back. I'm just going to read this section. As soon as I get to 5, I'm going to stop. So, a couple minutes. Okay. Okay. Lately, he seemed to have an amazing head for odds. There was a guy down in Augusta who'd take bets, and Joe had made almost $500 in the last 3 weeks. Not that Becca knew. He'd rat-holed it. It was funny. He'd know exactly who was going to win and why, and then he'd get down to Augusta and forget the why and only remember the who. But that was the important thing, wasn't it? Last time the guy in Augusta had grumbled, paying off at 3-1 on a $20 bet. Mets against the Pirates. Gooden on the mound. Looked like a cinch for the Mets, but Joe had taken the Pirates, and they'd won 5-2. Joe didn't know how much longer the guy in Augusta would take his bets. But if he stopped, so what? There was always Portland. There were 2 or 3 books there. It seemed like lately, is that for her? It seemed like lately he got a headache whenever he left Haven. Are you giving it to him now? Sit. Huh? Yeah? Okay. Easy. Easy. Seemed like lately he'd gotten a headache whenever he left Haven. Needed glasses, maybe. But when you were rolling hot, a headache was a small price to pay. Easy. Enough money, and the two of them could go away. Leave Becca with Jesus. That was who Becca wanted to be married to anyway. Easy. Easy. Cold as ice she was. But that Nancy, one hot ticket. Easy. Girl. And smart. You had yours from Daddy. But just today, she'd taken him out back at the PO to show him something. Look what I thought of. I think I ought to patent it, Joe. I really do. What, dear? Joe asked. The truth was, he felt a little mad with her. The truth was, he was more interested in her tits than her ideas. And mad or not, he was already getting a blue stealer. It really was like being a kid again. But what she showed him was enough to make him forget all about his blue stealer. For at least 4 minutes, anyway. Nancy Voss had taken a kid's Lionel train transformer and hooked it somehow to a bunch of D-cell batteries. This gadget was wired to 7 flour sifters with their screens knocked out. The sifters were laying on their sides when Nancy turned on the transformer. A number of filament-thin wires hooked to something that looked like a blender began to scoop first-class mail from a pile on the floor into the sifters, seemingly at random. What's it doing? Joe asked. You see what they're doing? Sorting the first class, she said. She pointed at one sifter after another. That one's Haven Village. That's RFD1, Dairy Road. You know, that one's Ridge Road. That one's Nista Road. That one's... He didn't believe it at first. He thought it was a joke, and he wondered how she'd like a slap upside the head. Why'd you do that? She'd whine. Some men can take a joke, he'd answer like Sylvester Stallone in the movie Cobra. But I ain't one of them. Except then, he saw it was really working. It was quite a gadget, all right. But the sound of the wires scraping across the floor was a little creepy, harsh and whispery, like big old spider's legs. It was working all right. Damned if he knew how, but it was. He saw one of the wires snag a letter of Rosk the Bald and push it into the correct sifter. RD2, which was the hammer cut road, even though it had been misaddressed to Haven Village. He wanted to ask her how it worked, but he didn't want to look like a goddamn dummy, so he asked her where she got the wires instead. One of those telephones I bought at Radio Shack, she said. The one at Bangor Mall. They were on sale. Oh, out of these telephones I bought. Excuse me. They were on sale. There's some other stuff from the phones in it too. I had to change everything around, but it was easy. It's just, came to me, Yeah, Joe said slowly. thinking about the bookie's face when Joe had come in to collect his $60 after the Pirates beat Gooden and the Mets. Not bad for a woman. For a moment her brow darkened and he thought, you want to say something? You want to fight? Come on, that's okay. That's just about as okay as the other. Then her brow cleared and she smiled. Now we can do it even longer. Her finger slid down the hard ridge in his pants. You do want to do it, don't you, Joe? And Joe did. They slipped to the floor, and he forgot all about being mad at her, and how all of a sudden he seemed to be able to figure the odds on everything from baseball games to horse races, golf matches, in the wink of an eye. He slid into her, and she moaned, and Joe even forgot the tenebrous whispering sound those wires made as they sifted the first-class mail into the row of flour sifters. And that is where we're going to pause. I lost my bookmark. That's what I'm looking for, my bookmark. I lost it. I don't know where I put it. Ah, there it is. All right, so that was a heavy reading. So I need to add some major disclaimers on this one. Not even sure how I would do this one. I will figure out the disclaimers when but I am going to let you guys go. Guys, go and clear your heads, and we will see what else Becca Paulson or Joe or whoever is next. Yeah, whatever Joe and Becca are up to tomorrow morning. Okay? So I will see you guys soon. I do pray that you can clear your heads. It's going to be a heavy book, and by the sounds of it, it's going to be, maybe that's the only things, but we'll see. Okay? But if I can catch it ahead of time before there's really anything said, I will let you guys know. All right? I love y'all. Y'all have a good night. I'll talk to you tomorrow morning. Bye.